So good evening, everyone. On behalf of Center for Jindal Center for the Global South and the Global South Research Foundation, I would like to welcome all of you to our today's guest lecture on understanding political economy, histories, theories, and the Global South. This session is actually part of our ongoing efforts to engage critically with the diverse intellectual traditions that shape our understanding of the world and specifically of the Global South. Today we have one of the most important, I consider, session we had because we are, Dr. Alex, our guest, he will share the foundations, his insights on the foundations of political economy with in a special focus to the Global South. So we are delighted to have as a guest speaker for our session today, our distinguished guest, Professor Alex M. Thomas. Professor Thomas is an associate professor of economics at Azim Premji University in Bengaluru in India. Today, Professor Thomas will guide us through the complex intersections of political economy, its histories and different theoretical traditions, and the most important part is its relevance to the Global South. So I believe that his lecture promises to challenge us to think critically about how economic ideas are embedded in a wider political and historical context. So for all our participants here, this is one of the most important topics. I would recommend you that you take notes and engage actively in the Q&A section at the end. Before moving and handing over to our guest speaker for today, Professor Alex, I would like to request my colleague, Dr. Malik, to give his welcome notes and then we will start with Professor Thomas' session. Over to you, Dr. Malik.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Am I audible? So, good evening and welcome to this special guest lecture being organized by Jindal Center for Global South, Jammu and Kashmir Economic Association, Global South Research Foundation. I, Dr. Firdous Ahmad Malik, currently working as assistant professor at University of People, and I am also founder and president of Jammu and Kashmir Economic Association. It is my honor to moderate today's session on understanding political economy, histories, theories, and the Global South. So before we start, I would like to introduce 1 minute about Jammu and Kashmir Economic Association, what we are doing at Jammu and Kashmir Economic Association. Jammu and Kashmir Economic Association is a pioneering organization that involves young scholars, academicians, policymakers in deliberations and debates, and we dialogue on important economic matters on the goal of finding solutions to existing challenges, world challenges. As Jammu and Kashmir is the first economic association at national level that promotes collaboration, policymakers, industrialists, and also we invite entrepreneurs to address economic issues effectively. It organizes research-focused events, workshops, and conferences to create a vibrant environment and empower economic growth in the region. This association facilitates inclusive dialogue and regional as well as national engagement to stimulate sustainable economic development in Jammu and Kashmir and beyond borders. So now let me introduce our distinguished resource person for this session. We are having with us Professor Alex Thomas. He is serving as Associate Professor at Azim Premji University, Bengaluru, India. Professor Thomas's research primarily focuses on history of economic thought, his special emphasis is on classical political economy. He has published extensively in reputed journals like Economic and Political Weekly, European Journal of Economic History, History of Economic Thought. He is also founding member of Indian Society for History of Economic Thought. He has also co-edited one book, Pluralistic Economics and its History. His book, Macroeconomics and Introduction, has been widely acclaimed and is used in several universities worldwide. As we embark on this intellectual journey, I invite you to reflect on two quotations that inspire this gathering today. So these quotations are: economics is everywhere, and understanding it helps us to see the world more clearly. And the second one is: progress is impossible without change. And those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. So let us engage deeply, listen thoughtfully, and contribute actively as we delve into the complexities of political economy together. I would love to, you know, give the session to Professor Alex. Over to you, please, Professor.
Thank you so much, Professor Hebatallah Adam and Dr. Firdous Malik. I must say that I'm very delighted to be here. And actually, when I think the initial invitation came, I only saw the Jammu and Kashmir Economic Association. So in my slide, I only have that, but I also want to acknowledge now the Global South Research Foundation too. And certainly, I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Is the screen visible and my slides are visible? Okay, thank you. So the purpose of today's lecture, discussion, and I think invitation for all of us to reflect on is I'm going to take you through political economy, focus a little bit on the history, talk about theories, and also the sort of relationship that people, those of us in the global south, have with these history and theories. And I'm aiming to spend about 40 minutes or so and then open it up for Q&A. So, but to begin with, I want to start by posing this question of what is political economy? And if we were to just sample different kind of books on the internet, you might come across these various titles. So on the left, I have Classical and Marxian Political Economy, which is an edited volume. There's another edited volume that I have here. It's called the Oxford Handbook of Historical Political Economy. There's a book titled Prelude to Political Economy by Kaushik Basu. And as I will soon argue that people use the word political economy in very different ways. And so I am going to use it in a particular way, and I will explain that shortly. Right. So again, if you were to go back and look at the history of economics itself, one will notice that, of course, when Ricardo was writing, he called it political economy. But when Marshall is writing, it has become principles of economics. And this book by Gerard Debreu, which is called Theory of Value, is often the foundations, or at least partly the foundations, of modern microeconomics. And as one can see that people have used economics differently, political economy differently, and today we might think that political economy is just politics and economics together. There are some people who might define it that way, but that's not the definition that I am going to adopt. And this is the way I am defining classical political economy and political economy for our purposes. Right? So the standpoint, or where I'm coming from, is from two areas. One is from my broad research in the history of economic thought, but focused primarily on classical political economy, and from my teaching of economics, and I'll talk about the teaching after this. First and foremost, I want to define classical political economy differently from what we saw in the previous slides. whether it's historical political economy or prelude to a political economy, that is not the way in which we are defining classical political economy. It essentially refers to the economic ideas that originated in France and in England in the 1700s, in the work of Cantillon, in the work of Kenney, and later in Adam Smith and David Ricardo. But I'm also calling Marx, I've put a star there because Marx also had a critique of classical political economy. But for my purposes, I'm including Marx also within the broader tradition of political economy. And also, political economy is an active research tradition. I think it's important to mention that because it is not just that, yes, Smith and Ricardo worked on political economy, but we also have people who are writing in the 1900s and in the 2000s, like Piero Sraffa, Pierangelo Garigliani, and Krishna Bharadwaj, who actually set up the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in JNU. She also worked in this tradition of classical political economy, and there are many people across the world who work in this area. But it is important also for me to highlight here that classical political economy is not a dominant field of research. Because of that, it means that, of course, relative to the mainstream field of research, you have a smaller number of people who are working in these political economy traditions. What is it within teaching of economics that I want to highlight? One is that there are multiple paradigms or multiple schools of thought. So that is, I mean, the idea of pluralism, but very often when most of us go to study economics, whether in our bachelor's or in our master's or even in our PhD, we are only exposed to one school of thought. And that is what I will call as marginalist economics. This is the economics that was primarily developed by Marshall, by Jevons, by Walras, and people like Samuelson, Hicks, and others have developed it, and that's what we learn. And in the context of history of economic thought, it is especially important that we understand the roots of our current discipline. Even if it is the mainstream economics that we are talking about, what was Marshall's contributions? What was Jevons's contributions? Did they make certain assumptions that we need to rethink? Maybe for the global south or maybe in general. So that is one aspect. The other aspect, and here I've put Indian economic thought, but I think we could very well put economic thought from the global south because the mainstream of the profession is anyway centered in the global north. So, but there have been many economic ideas that have, that economists from the global south and other policymakers, political activists have developed and engaged with. How do we bring those to bear upon our profession and our discipline? And the third point is critical pedagogy. And actually, in a way, this goes a little bit to the opening statements made earlier, because the purpose, and I quite like that, because the purpose of my presentation is also to raise some questions and have a kind of discussion towards the end of it. If we look at the vocabulary of economists that is very commonly used, we hear terms like competition, market, supply and demand, wage, gross domestic product, tax, efficiency, short run, price level. Now, these are all terms that economists use, and economists are saying that we have a particular expertise in these terms and what happens when we actually formulate policy. But I'm going to take a slightly critical approach here because very often we say, and I'm calling it the rhetoric of intuition, because what I mean by that is the following. Very often economists and mainstream economists argue that when the supply of labor increases relative to the demand for labor, it is intuitive for wages to go down, or it is natural for wages to go down, it is normal for wages to go down. Or people might argue that when the supply of tomato increases relative to the demand for tomatoes, again, it is natural for tomato prices to go down. it is normal, it is intuitive for tomato prices to go down. So the word intuition, I think, is often used by scholars in various traditions, but it is not obvious. I do not think that by intuition we can say that it is obvious, because intuition is a construct. Uh, and in this context, it is a particular intellectual construct within a particular economics paradigm. And I mean, I've just put this quote here, which is from Paradise Lost by John Milton. And I like that quote very much, because very often we think that there is probably something natural about reason. But, this quote which says that reason also is choice. And that brings me to the question of what paradigm are we operating in? What paradigm are our policymakers operating in? Right? And this is the point that I want to first sort of make, and then get into specifics of it, which is that the intuition of economists depends on the paradigm. And I've already sort of mentioned classical political economy and Marxian political economy. And I've already mentioned marginalist economics, which is the dominant paradigm. But we can also think in terms of Keynesian economics and Austrian economics, which are also alternative paradigms. So, what we call as intuition is really the product of our knowledge of a particular paradigm. And I just want to give two simple examples for this. Maybe I'll just give one, which is the paradox of thrift, which is very well known in the work of Keynes, which is essentially that in marginalist economics, we believe that if something is good for an individual, it is good for the economy as a whole. So for the household, it is good if we are saving more, or if we become more thrifty. But then Keynes argued that this is wrong, because if you take the Keynesian paradigm, it means that if everyone is saving, it means that there is less consumption, less aggregate demand, less income, less employment, and therefore individuals have less to save. So, within one paradigm, saving is seen as a good thing, increasing saving, which is a marginalist paradigm. Whereas in the Keynesian paradigm, saving too much is not really good for the economy. So, when economists talk about intuition, I think that it's important for us to sort of think about and reflect which paradigm they are working from. So now let me get into the specifics of some categories in political economy and in mainstream economics, so that I can sort of demonstrate to you the importance of looking at the history of these concepts, but also understanding various theories across paradigms, because they have far-reaching implications for policy and politics, not just in the global south, across the world. Right? So my focus is going to just be on essentially on four concepts: wages, competition, the idea of power, markets, and I'm also going to make some remarks about time, because it sort of plays a role in many of the discussions that economists have one way or the other. And some of this might be well known to you, but I hope that you will get some insights on at least the political economy aspect of it. But I also wanted to do this in contrast with marginalist economics, so that we can understand the differences between them and what is at stake. So, and by marginalist economics, I must clarify that I'm talking about the standard economics that is often taught in microeconomics and macroeconomics across the world in undergraduate programs. So, the traditional understanding is that there is an inverse relationship between wages and the quantity of labor. Right? So, which means that if there is a lot of labor in the market, it has a tendency to push wages downwards. And this is sort of captured within this wage equals function of labor. And this is built on the idea of supply and demand for labor. And in equilibrium, the workers or the wages are supposed to equal what is called the marginal product of labor. Right? Now, at this moment, we just need to think in terms of what this means is that the market is sort of determining within itself, based on the idea of productivity, specifically marginal productivity, that this is how much wages have to be. In other words, in some sense, one could argue that in this kind of a paradigm and understanding, workers get what they contribute. Right? They're contributing something and they're getting something in return for that. And within marginalist economics, within this kind of a construction, there is a tendency to the full employment of labor. Now let's take a look at classical political economy. How are wages determined? Interestingly, people who work in this tradition argue that you cannot have a mathematical formula for the determination of wages. You cannot reduce the determination of wages to some kind of a statistical formula or a mathematical formula, and that it is determined by history and culture. Now, what do these economists mean by that? It means that there is a role for bargaining, there is a role for customs. So if custom is such that in a particular region that we think that people all need to have access to internet, then it needs to be a part of wages. There is also this idea of what is necessary. And I think that this is a very important idea because it also has a connection with our ethical standpoint, or a society's ethical standpoint as to what we think is essential for everyone in the society to live a dignified life. Right? So, as you can see, marginalist economics has a very specific understanding of what determines wages, which is essentially productivity or marginal productivity. Whereas in classical political economy, it is very different. It is determined by history and culture. And this also means that economists who are working in this tradition have to have more conversations with historians and anthropologists to understand what is the specific history and culture that exists in our particular locality. And this I just want to share because I think that this might be sort of familiar to you if you have studied economics. But this essentially means that the equilibrium is given by the intersection of the supply and demand for labor, right? And as you can see, you have a minimum wage which is imposed on top of the equilibrium wage. And once the minimum wage is imposed, marginalist economics tells you that it leads to unemployment. In other words, minimum wage is not really good for the economy because it leads to unemployment. Right. And let me just go back to this to argue that within classical political economy, minimum wages is seen to be, at least it's not seen that there is no inverse relationship between wages and employment. Therefore, one cannot make any claim saying that if you impose minimum wages, it is bad for employment. And let me get little bit into the question of policy because a part of our discussion and part of the title is also about the implications for Global South. But here, when we are talking about wages, we spoke about theory, but I also want to talk about the question of measurement because the kind of theoretical training that we have also has an impact on how we would like to measure these concepts. And of course, related to measurement is we also have the question of policy. Right? So within marginalist economics, what are we interested in measuring? We are interested in measuring the idea, the marginal product of labor. And because we want to measure marginal product, we need to know some calculus, differential calculus. What is the standard policy recommendation? It is that labor laws have to be relaxed. Minimum wages are not good for the economy. When you contrast that with classical political economy, what to study, what we need to study is understand the history, understand the culture, right? And the policy recommendations is very clear that it is favorable to minimum wage and it is also favorable to collective bargaining. So as you can see that the theories are very different. Both these schools of thought are trying to study the same economic phenomena, but the way they are studying it is different and the policy recommendations are different. Now, let me move on to the second point, which is about competition. Right? In economic theory, there's a more specific way in which economists have understood competition. In marginalist economics, perfect competition is usually understood to mean a large number of buyers and sellers, firms are price takers, there is perfect information. Right. Now, this is a very restrictive assumption because one would think that in competition, a firm should be able to change their prices or at least adjust whatever they want to adjust. But this is a special kind of way in which competition has been defined. In classical political economy, there is a different kind of understanding of competition, and it's called free competition, where they argue that all that one needs to assume is the free mobility of labor and capital. And so it's a little less restrictive. And the implication is that this leads to a tendency to a uniform rate of profit. Now, at this point, I need to tell you that both these concepts, whether it is perfect competition or free competition, these are abstract notions and these do not exist in the world that we see around us as it is. Right? But having said that, because in any kind of scientific intellectual endeavor, we engage in abstraction, we engage in simplification, we engage in trying to cull out, what is essential to make some sense of the phenomena. So abstraction is essential. The question here is, which is a better abstraction? And now moving on to the question of policy and measurement. So this quotation that I have here, I've actually taken it from the Competition Commission of India website, where let me just read this quote out. Competition is the best means of ensuring that the common man or Aam Aadmi has access to the broadest range of goods and services at the most competitive prices. With increased competition, producers will have maximum incentive to innovate and specialize. This would result in reduced costs and wider choice to consumers. Now, this particular ideal is what all of us want, right? We want to have innovation. We want to have choice for consumers. We want to have reduced costs. But the question, I mean, one of the questions is how do we understand competition? Are we understanding it in the sense of perfect competition? Are we understanding it in the sense of free competition? Now, irrespective of that, how are we measuring competition? And that really comes from our intuition that comes from the particular paradigm that we are exposed to. Right? So, do we measure competition in terms of the mobility of labor? Do we measure competition in terms of efficiency? Now, of what and why would we measure it in terms of efficiency? The next concept that I want to talk about is power. Right? Power, in the social science sense of the term of power, that some people or some groups have more power than other groups. In marginalist economics, in mainstream economics, the way in which they are being able to accommodate power is through these concepts, such as asymmetry. So you have asymmetric information. I have more information than you, or the idea of rigidity that because the market is rigid and not competitive, wages cannot be pushed downwards. Or similar kind of notion which is called imperfections. So the market is imperfect, not perfect. So it might be because of imperfect knowledge. So you have these concepts. You also have factors of production which put all these various land, labor, capital, organization on the same footing. And the theory of income distribution, what you find in marginalistic economics is a just kind of form of income distribution. We think that under these conditions of competition, it is possible for all of us to get what we contribute. But if we take a look at the paradigm of political economy, of classical political economy, we notice a very different kind of conceptual framework. They are not talking in terms of individuals, as in marginalist economics, but they're talking in terms of social classes. Now, the advantage of social classes is that it allows for theorists to say that at a particular point in time, a particular social class has more power than other social classes. So, for instance, during feudalism, of course, landowners had more power than other classes in the society. After the onset of capitalism, one can argue that capitalists have more power than workers. So all kinds of combinations are possible depending on the particular historical context that we are talking about, depending on the particular institutional arrangement that we are talking about. And the theory of income distribution in this political economy paradigm, as I mentioned earlier, is not based on any formula. It is not necessarily just or fair. It really depends on history and culture. Right? And I think that to me personally, what this allows us to do is, if we are able to understand the problem correctly, then we are able to formulate appropriate policies. But if we understand the problem incorrectly or vaguely because of our flawed paradigm, then our policies might also be not very helpful. And here I want to share a particular passage from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, because very often when we talk about power, when we talk about competition, many mainstream economists argue that Adam Smith was a champion of the free market or liberal capitalism, but it's not quite true, right? And let me just, let me just read out some passages from this extract. Right? And the second line that I'm reading here is that, and Smith is writing here, the workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. The former are disposed to combine in order to raise, that is, the workers combine in order to raise their wages, the latter in order to lower the wages of labor. That is, the latter, as in the masters or the capitalists, also come together to lower the wages of labor. Right? And the next line is interesting because Adam Smith is writing here that we have no acts of parliament against combining to lower the price of work, but many against combining to raise it. Right? And here in the next sentence, he's very clear who is much more powerful. In all such disputes, the masters can hold out much longer. Right? So I think that the reason that I wanted to share this passage is that Smith is very clear in his Wealth of Nations that which is the group that has more power than other groups. And understanding this allows us to formulate appropriate policies. And this is taken from my macroeconomics book. Of course, the extract is from Smith's Wealth of Nations. Right. Now, moving on to markets, which is again a term that policymakers use, journalists use, economists use, and I just want to get a little bit into the specifics of it. If for economists in general, if we ask, how do you understand markets? Most economists are going to give the answer in terms of supply and demand. So you have the supply schedule, you have the demand schedule, and under conditions of competition, you have this particular equilibrium, which is the intersection of supply and demand. Right? And you have an equilibrium price and you have an equilibrium quantity. Right? This is the version that was given by Marshall, and this is what most economists today take to mean how the market functions or what is the market logic. So market logic is actually coming from the contribution that has been made by economists such as Marshall, and this is within the marginalist paradigm. Right. Now, let me try to show you how the concepts in marginalist economics and classical political economy actually differ. Right? How are the theories different? Both these schools of thought, both these paradigms have spoken about markets. Right? When marginalist economics is talking about market, they're talking in terms of supply and demand schedule. They're talking of symmetric forces of supply and demand. Right? There's a particular functional relationship between prices and quantity. Whereas in classical political economy, they distinguish between use value and exchange value. Right? So what this essentially means is that, to put it a little crudely, utility does not determine prices or exchange value. Right? For these economists, I've put a star after labor theory of value because people like Sraffa have a different theory of value, which I'm not getting into, but just for a kind of contrast and simplicity, I'm just using the labor theory of value, right? Which means that essentially prices are determined by labor and not by utility. Whereas for marginalist economics, even today, in some sense, utility is what drives prices. In classical political economy, there is no symmetric relationship between supply and demand. In fact, they argue that supply adapts to demand. Right? Similarly, there is no functional relationship between prices and quantities, and this is very important. There's absolutely no functional relationship between prices and quantities. And people who are working in this tradition, like Krishna Bharadwaj, also spoke about how markets come together and how there are groups of people who might occupy power within these markets, which she called the idea of interlinked markets. This is the final sort of concept that I'm talking about, and then I'll end with 3 or 4 slides on broader concluding remarks. So there have been various debates with respect to time in economics, and one of the popular ones is by Joan Robinson, where she distinguishes between logical time and historical time. Essentially, the argument is that if you move across logical time, you can move from point A to point B and back from point B to point A. But when we talk about historical time, if I'm going from today to tomorrow, once I'm at tomorrow, I cannot come back to today. Right? So while logical time, you can move across space, but the movement across time is not really reversible. And this was the key point that she was trying to make, asking us the question that if there are movements happening across space, can we actually translate them to movements across time, or do we need a different kind of theory? There are also discussions on what is short run and what is long run. And there's this very specific, definition within economics. I'm not getting into that, but I want to talk about the notion of equilibrium. Because equilibrium is what gives us some reason to argue that this kind of a policy or this kind of an institutional arrangement might be good for people, right? Because it leads to, let's say, an improvement in efficiency, or let's say it reduces prices, or let's say it increases employment, right? But within economics, actually, there are all kinds of equilibrium concepts. And if you take a look at the history of equilibrium, it's also fascinating. But you have the idea of intertemporal equilibrium, you have the idea of partial equilibrium, you have the idea of general equilibrium, you have Nash equilibrium in game theory, there's simultaneous equilibrium, sequential equilibrium. Without getting into the specifics, all I'm submitting to you with this slide really is that I think that we need to spend more time thinking about the relationship between logical time and historical time and the implications that it has for these various notions of equilibrium. Now, to conclude, what I've done so far is to demonstrate to you that mainstream economics, which is particularly marginalist economics, has a particular kind of history and specific set of theories with a particular set of policy implications, the standard theory. Right? So, and if you take a look at the history of ideas itself, what has happened between classical political economy and marginalist economics is that social classes have translated into factors of production. Now, with that transition, the idea of structural power has gone missing. The idea of free competition has moved to perfect competition. Free competition was a little more flexible, and perfect competition a little more stringent and rigid. Classical political economists thought of wages as being determined by history and culture, exogenous distribution, but marginalist economists think that you can have a formula for determining wages. Prices was determined by labor, then it got shifted to utility. And in all this, political economy is called political economy because it recognizes that when we are talking about material resources, you cannot have a formula for distribution. It is about power, it is about democratic processes, it is about people coming collectively together to decide how much to distribute the total output or the surplus that we have. But unfortunately, when marginalist economics sort of wanted to, sort of push out political economy and they changed the name from political economy to economics because they wanted the subject to be more like physics, right? So more like the natural sciences, and that is why this change happened. Of course, now political economy is called many things. Now, what are the implications for the teaching of economics? I think in general, but specifically in the global south, I think that we cannot afford to teach only the dominant paradigm. We cannot afford to teach only marginalist economics. We need to teach alternative paradigms. We cannot have monism. We need to have pluralism. And often we do not really have an exposure to the history of these ideas. And even in the case that we might have the history, we often think in a linear cumulative view of history, which suggests that the idea of factors of production is necessarily more scientific and much better than social classes, or the idea that perfect competition is much better than free competition. But this is not the way how ideas develop. There's often ideas compete with each other. Some ideas are dominant. So we need to really understand that history does not progress in a linear slash cumulative manner. And I think whether we are a policymaker or a journalist or an academic or a student, we need to also recognize that there are fashions in economics. And these fashions in economics might tell us what is dominant at a particular time. So if somebody gets a Nobel Prize, then we think that this is the best approach. Right? So whether it's RCT or behavioral economics. And here I just want to point out this thing about the idea of this benchmark, or about the idea of the dominant paradigm, or the idea of intuition, right? We have, I mean, for instance, I've mentioned behavioral economics here. Now, behavioral economics is often seen as a kind of challenge to neoclassical economics or mainstream economics. While it is true that initially it was like that, subsequently they also use similar ideas like marginalist economics. It's essentially a science of choice. It runs on individuals, again, methodological individualism, right? And it's similar, or there are some expansions to new welfare economics. And this is one way that I want to characterize these so-called new fields within economics. And if one is, I mean, as a historian of economic thought, with some understanding of philosophy of science and drawing on Lakatos's idea here, it's essentially that you have the hardcore, which is marginalist economics, and then you have these new fields which question some of these assumptions of marginalist economics, but the hardcore remains intact. So, I mean, Lakatos called it protective bells. So I argue that behavioral economics or new institutional economics, welfare economics, neuroeconomics, all of these are actually not new paradigms, but they are really protective bells around the paradigm of marginalist economics. And finally, because we are scholars in the global south, I think, as I mentioned earlier, and let me just repeat, a critical engagement with the mainstream is essential because, of course, that is the language that most people are using. We need to engage with the assumptions critically. We need to understand our history. We need to understand why certain methods are dominant. And at the same time, we need to have a study of alternative paradigms. Whether we are talking about classical political economy, Marxian political economy, or feminist political economy, or we want to think of ideas from the global south, we need to engage with that. And finally, I think that again, global south is an abstraction. We need to be cognizant of our local context through a conversation with anthropologists, through methods like ethnography, through oral history. So it cannot only be, of course, we can take quantitative information, but we need to look at a variety of quantitative and qualitative approaches to economics. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Alex, for the insightful and also informative presentations that you have shared with us, especially for our students from UG and PG, and also we have some doctoral scholars. So I believe they have got today more depth into political economy foundations. So I request, please, our participants to prepare their questions. And meanwhile, before they start raising their hand, and we will give them time to impose the question themselves to Dr. Alex. Since my main area of interest is Global South, so Professor Alex, I have one first question to you, is that how do colonial histories continue to shape the political economies of Global South, especially given the current context and the geo-economic and geopolitical context that our world is facing? So this is a first question. And the second one is, since we are discussing today theories, so how can the Global South contribute to reshape the global economic thought? What do we need as researchers and academicians in the Global South to share our original contributions in the political economy theories? So over to you, Dr. Alex. And meanwhile, maybe Professor also Malik has some questions to ask, and then we will move to our participants.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Hebatallah, for your questions. So what I will try to do is, because my expertise is not, well, how do I put it, in the kind of question that you asked, but I'm just going to try and answer that question based on my own kind of expertise. So I'm not going to really answer the question of the impact of colonial history or colonialism on economies or societies like India, but I'm going to pose the question is, how do we understand our colonial history? So I'm sort of reversing the question only to point out that even within the Indian context, economic historians often use the mainstream paradigm of marginalist economics to understand what happened during colonial India. And I think that they often end up not using, I would say, concepts or ideas from alternative traditions to try and understand what was really happening. And I often, share this particular problem or issue when this question is asked, is that if we think that economic growth in the past is because, or economic growth today is driven by capital accumulation or saving, if we think like that, then historians are going to go back and try to find this kind of data in the archives and trying to compile it, trying to understand what's happening. But if I believe that it is the consumption of the workers, it is the demand of the workers that is actually driving the economy, then as an economic historian, I should be trying to find that information. So the kind of work that I do is really questioning what is the lens, or what is the theoretical framework or the methodological approach that we are using to study a phenomena, often not realizing that there are multiple paradigms, and maybe a better paradigm might, or a different paradigm might give a different answer to it. But having said that, I think one of the problems I think is, especially in economics programs, I can talk about India, which is that we do not have courses on economic history. We might have several courses on econometrics, on techniques, on microeconomics, on macroeconomics, but we forget to actually have a systematic course on economic history. So I would think, in a way, I mean, and I'm thinking from a more pedagogical point of view here for training policymakers, journalists, I think a course on economic history of our own context is absolutely important. Now, to the second question of what the global south can do, and again, I'm going to try and answer based on what I know a little bit from the Indian economic thought, which is that I often ask students in my class, how many Indian economists do you know? Not the people who are alive today, but in the past. And often they don't know anyone. But I don't think it is their problem, because we as educators, we as people who are making the curriculum, we are drawing on ideas, or especially in economics, let's say textbooks which are written by people in the US. Because economics is sort of dominated by research associations, journals, conferences, research funds, etc., coming from the US. So I think that, I mean, we need to figure out, even at the level of pedagogy, at the level of curriculum, how to incorporate voices from amongst us. Because it is not the case necessarily that people in the global south or people in India did not have anything useful to say. In fact, at least I've studied many economists within India who have contributed to global knowledge by publishing in international journals. But unfortunately, I think we have not done a good job of documenting their work. That is one. I think there's not enough research, I think, on ideas from the global south, more generally speaking. And I think that this is a big project that is waiting to be done. Some conversations are, I think, between people from the global south and the global north, but there are also conversations which are just happening within the global south or within local contexts. And how do we bring that up? And which is why in the last slide, I actually mentioned oral history, because there are many traditions where groups of people or societies or communities are not writing anything down, but have a particular economic idea which is not written down. But then how do we capture those alternative ideas? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And also, I would add that I believe that researchers, academicians from Global South should aim to publish high quality papers. So then only it will be cited by others, and our ideas will be quoted and cited by the Global North. And also, we should also support our colleagues from Global South by citing their ideas and not only depending on the main ideas and foundational theories that were set by the Global North academicians and theorists. We do have lots also of ideas that are coming from Global South, and the issue is that some of these ideas also, they are not written in English. They can be written in other languages, Global South languages. So this is one of the main also obstacles in citing them and making their ideas to be also written in textbooks and shared widely. So I agree with you, Dr. Thomas. More works we should do and we should advocate to, as we are responsible researchers from the Global South. Professor Malik, do you have questions? Then we can move to the Q&A section.
Yes, thank you very much.
Or
It was
comments. It can be comments also.
I am having one question. So it is regarding to the methodology. So since last 2 decades, the academia, especially students with the background or scholars with the background of economics, they have made a transition towards econometric modeling and publishing with using certain modeling techniques. Now the transition has, it is now, I think, the reverse is happening. So how can both economic, political economic theories or conceptual ideas can be used to interpolate that, so that we can have the essence of both, that they go both together and they can improve or have a larger impact as per the understanding of political economy or empirical studies is concerned. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Malik, for that question. I think this is the challenge really, because it's true that and okay, so let me rephrase my answer. So I think that we need to have pluralism in theory where we know that multiple paradigms operate. We also know that within methods, there are many methods to study a problem. But what has happened in economics, I think, which is a little maybe unusual, is that it is the method that dominates. But it's not the research question that often dominates. Because today, if I were to write a paper and try to send it to a top journal which does not use a dominant method, it will not get published. So it is no longer about how convincing your argument is alone. It People are convinced only if you use a particular method. So if somebody does field work and just ethnographic work, it will not be published in a top 5 economics journal. If somebody uses heterodox or non-mainstream political economy theoretical approach and tries to do econometric work, even that will not be published. So there is a peculiar problem, I think, which is probably a little more peculiar to economics. So I think for our students, my approach is to say that we need to teach them that depending on the research question, you might use a different method. It is absolutely important to teach them quantitative techniques. Along with that, we need to teach them qualitative techniques. Right? So because it is possible that tomorrow the Nobel Prize might go for someone who has done field work. And I think we cannot, I mean, the purpose of education should be to give everyone a set of tools that can be used depending on the problem at hand. But we cannot restrict the set of tools based on what is dominant today. So I think that is where I will think we need to have courses on history of economic thought and economic history, which also provide perspective. And in fact, I mean, if we take the history of economics teaching itself, in the 1980s, history of economic thought was a compulsory course in the PhD programs in the US. So, and I mean, because of that across the world, so a lot of changes have happened in how economics is taught because we often follow what happens in the US too. So there's a little bit of that relationship which we also need to sort of understand. But I'm not saying that we have to completely reject what is happening, but we need to be able to engage with our ideas, global south ideas. We need to be able to engage with multiple methods, both quantitative and qualitative.
Thanks, Dr. Thomas. Please, for our participants, if you have questions, you may raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Dr. Thomas.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, so please ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the session, organizers and Professor Alex Thomas. So my question is that I'm asking from a personal point of view that I had studied long back in the UG courses economic history, and in the PG level I had studied history of economic thought. As you correctly pointed out, the references back were there, Mark Bloch and all Western. I never heard of Krishna Bharadwaj unless I came across some of your papers, right, Alex, sir, right? I keep following you for your articles and all that. I missed narrowly by your offline presentation also in Kolkata when you visited in St. Xavier's. So my question is how do and I'll be teaching history of economic thought in the next year to the undergrad students. So it's been a long gap. So what will be your advice to me? Like, how do I differentiate or segregate, expose to the students, between economic history and then history of economic thought? And what are the references that you'd suggest to me, like, so that it will be an easy, smooth ride for the UG level students? Like, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's have a couple of questions and then Dr. Thomas will address all at the end. Any other question?
Hello.
Yes, Dr. Jaskaran.
Myself, Jaskar. My question is about the intervention of market economists in these days. Like they are saying that expansion of market makes available the things to the even poor peoples. For example, the mobile market, or we say internet market in India. For example, they are saying that it provides the accessibility to even the marginalized people. How we should respond to these kind of questions? And my last question to Professor Thomas. Professor, you usually, even in your book also, you are a kind of have reluctancy using neoclassical economics, like you use marginalist economics. Like even in our textbooks, when we teach our students, we use even sometimes classical economics in textbooks when we teach them. Like in many books, people are saying that like Marshall brings classical economics and the marginalist economics get closer to each other, like supply and demand curves. How we should see this juncture? Thank you.
Thank Dr. Jaskaran. Any other question? Okay, so then Dr. Thomas, we have 3 questions. So over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sushma, for your question on the difference between economic history and history of economic thought. So, various kinds of questions can be addressed in history of economic thought. Let me just try to give an example. So, if I'm interested in the question of what were Adam Smith's views on economic development, now that would be a history of economic thought kind of question and approach to take. But if I'm interested to know when Adam Smith was writing, what was the state of affairs of Scotland or state of affairs of England, then I will be adopting a more economic history approach, trying to look at the archival documents or trying to look at any quantitative data that existed, church records. So they are little, I mean, they can be brought together, but they are a little different in its approach and the kind of question that we are trying to answer. Right. So I mean, the way in which I do history of economic thought is also slightly, I mean, it's similar to some others, but people can do it differently. For instance, people can ask the question, what were the social and economic and political factors that contributed to Adam Smith's writing? Was he responding to some events of his time? So you need to have a kind of historical understanding. So having said that, it is, and one more thing I must say that I think sometimes, maybe in India, people think that history of economic thought does not have mathematics. I think that is not correct. Mathematics is just a language. You can use mathematics in history of economic thought. In fact, if you want to study Srafa, you need to know mathematics. If you want to do some exercise with Keynes or Kalitsky, you need to know mathematics. So I think we should also dispel this idea that there is no mathematics in history of economic thought. Now, to your specific question, of course, I don't think I can give a full answer to it, given that I don't think this is the appropriate platform. But if you email me, I can give you a longer answer. But except to say that because you're teaching in a college in Kolkata, I think that it would be helpful if you can bring in at least one or two economists from your region. Of course, there is no dearth of Bengali economists, but maybe not somebody very famous, maybe a little less famous, but has contributed to our understanding. Because that can get, I think, students of that region really excited and interested. Now, moving to the question that Jaskaran asked, expansion of the market. helps with this. The question that I would be interested in asking and knowing from these people is, what is your idea of the market? Is it coming from Walras's notion of general equilibrium, which suggests that there is some kind of an efficient point? Right? So you need to have some worldview. It's not based on evidence as such, because there are so many ways to capture evidence, and I don't think that is probably fully convincing. So it is coming from often from some theoretical position based on which they are arguing that this is how things happen. Right? And the question is it coming from, let's say, Walrus or not? And then one can get into at least understand where they're coming from. And I think that's important. Now, to your second question and comment. So I do not use the term neoclassical economics because the term neoclassical suggests that there is a continuity between classical economics of Smith Ricardo and the marginalist economics of Jevons and Walras. But I think that they're completely two different paradigms. Right? Of course, you can try to synthesize them if you wish, but fundamentally, they're different paradigms. And in fact, it is Alfred Marshall who's responsible for this continuity thesis or argument. Right? He sort of believed that he wanted to bring these two schools of thought together. And it is Thorstein Veblen, who coined this term neoclassical economics, partly based on sort of Marshall. But let me just mention one more thing and end the answer. A lot of confusion is because of Keynes. Because when Keynes wrote his general theory, he defined classical economics as everyone before him. Now, that is a very poor definition. Right? There's no analytical sense to it. Right? So, although his criticisms were at marginalist economics like Marshall and Pigou, also a little bit Ricardo, but he was not really criticizing classical political economy. Right? But because textbooks then came to be written, in macroeconomics textbook, the first chapter is called classical macroeconomics, which is actually marginalist macroeconomics, which is the economics of Marshall and Pigou. And then it goes to Keynesian macroeconomics, which is actually Hicks's ISNLM, which is also a kind of marginalist interpretation. So I think partly because of Keynes, partly because of how textbooks are written, I think students and teachers equally get confused about so many different definitions of classical economics, neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics.
Okay, so I believe we don't have other questions. Yeah.
Having any question, please go ahead. So as there is no question, I will request to participants if they can on their camera for group photo before we
Yes.
will proceed for formal vote of thanks.
Yeah, please. So please, if you are in a good position to on your camera, so please use the background we shared and turn on your camera. So now we are coming to a close to our today guest lectures that we are organizing at Jindal Center for the Global South Research Foundation and Jammu and Kashmir Economic Association. Before we end this session, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to our guest for today, Professor Alex M. Thomas, for sharing this insightful and informative presentation on the political history of political economy and his perspectives about the subject. And of course, definitely we can say that today's lecture has deepened our understanding of political economy. And also, we can say that we got also important tools and ideas to think about the Global South in a historical context and theoretical dimensions. Thank you all to all our participants, and thank you, Professor Malik, for our ongoing collaboration in organizing such insightful guest lectures and panel discussions to our participants from India and also from all over the world, because we have today foreign participants who have joined us. Now let's formally conclude this session, and before we end, we would like to have a group photo with all the participants. So please, if you can open your camera, start opening. I request please IT team to stop recording.